Hello and welcome to the Good Practice Podcast, a weekly show about work, performance and learning. I'm Ross Dickie, and this week we're talking about uncertainty in the workplace. I'm joined by podcast regular James McLuckie. Hello, James.
Hi, Ross.
Along with guest Doug Shaw, who is an artist and consultant. Is that a good description of what you do, Doug?
Suitably accurate and suitably vague at the same time. Perfect.
That's what I was going for. Do you want to actually just kick us off by explaining a little bit about your background? Because you have quite an interesting role.
Thank you. So my background, as far back as I care to remember, was initially in sales and marketing, and one of the things I really enjoyed about being in that role was the ability to be able to begin to look at things less transactionally and much more with more of an emphasis on relationships and trying to understand what makes people tick and how do we kind of get on and relate to one another as effectively, I suppose, being the sort of foundation of any and all good business, you could argue. And I just became fascinated in people and what makes us tick and how we work together and how that works well sometimes and less well other times. And through continuing to sort of develop my interest in that, I noticed that people are, without even realising it, quite inherently improvisational and free-flowing, yet at the same time, in a workplace context, they're very often hamstrung by a perceived need for certainty. You know, things have to balance, and I get that certainty is a very important thing in certain environments. You know, you want to get on an aeroplane and be as confident as you can be that it's going to take off and land with you safely in it at the other end. But when we're looking at how we learn and develop, I think actually uncertainty is a really important part of the mix. In fact, it's inherent. It's all about curiosity and being willing to try and do things differently. And I think that most people get that at one level. But what I noticed was that actually they've struggled to practice with it and play with it. And I think that's because, like I say, we're in a world where very often people have to report back on things and that those things might have to be measured in some way, shape or form. And so we end up, I think, limiting our horizons because we become unwilling to it's not even about taking risks, but just almost take chances and place small bets, for want of another word. So I found, for me, a way of helping people think differently about uncertainty and what it means and what opportunities it might present was to begin to look at things from a more explicitly creative perspective. So I started to bring my interest as an artist to bear on my consulting practice. And I kept the two things sort of separate for quite a while, but it became clearer to me over time that actually there's something at the heart of uncertainty that the arts allow you to get at, if you like, principally because they're a subjective group of interests, so they facilitate inquiry rather than certainty. So that's the kind of things that have interested me in the past and sort of brought me here to a point where I now am much more comfortable and confident to use both those sort of facets, if you like, in the pursuit of a single aim, which could be about people getting to know each other better. It could be about just doing things differently. It could be trying new ways of designing customer experience. It doesn't really matter what it is, but it's about being willing to open up to the fact that there are probably many more possibilities than we might first consider.
Yeah. So, how do you actually incorporate your art into the work that you do with organizations? If you were to paint us a picture, if you will, of what that would look like.
Well, everything evolves and everything changes. And one of the things I found very interesting when I first started using art more organically, if you like. So there was a stage where I was interested in and would use the arts, but I would use other people's art. So we could maybe begin a conversation with perhaps a work by Francis Bacon or somebody, and then have a conversation about how do we react and respond to that as a way of opening up the fact that we can all look at the same thing and see different things. But I felt that was a little bit abstract and a little bit distant. So I began to invite people to create their own art as a way of exploring and identifying what it means to be a little bit uncertain about things. And I'm going back now to probably started doing this in 2011, 2012. And so I was able to participate as a very naive artist at that point, because my own artistic practice was very naive and very clunky. And so I developed a few sort of simple principles to enable people to begin to play. So, for example, I would encourage people to draw for the bin. So don't make art with the intention of showing it in the Royal Academy. Make art with the intention of throwing it away, and that will actually loosen you up and free you up. And I also began to realise that actually the notion of creativity as a thing is not necessarily open to misinterpretation, but it's actually something that can exist along quite a sliding scale. So I think the reason why a lot of people don't like to play with the creative aspects of their work is because they might see creativity as quite a chaotic, messy thing, which it can be, but it can be just a little bit different from what you're doing now. So again, I encourage people to sort of play with that notion and recognise that the environment that they're operating in is relevant to some extent. And if it's not going to tolerate a complete load of mess and chaos, then don't offer that to it, but just try and do something different and start something, to get that curiosity going. And I think the other thing I found that was very helpful in the early stages was just the acceptance that these things need to be persisted with. So actually, if you do try something different, there's a reasonable chance it might not work, or it might not work as you expected it to. And again, art's a really good way of figuring that out, because if you ask someone to draw, I don't know, your favourite pet or whatever, if someone's got one, then the actual end result might not look that much like the favourite pet, but it kind of doesn't matter really, because they've begun the process. And actually, if they were to repeat the exercise 100 times, they'd find themselves getting a lot better at it. So there's all kinds of ways that I find it an interesting thing to play with. The challenge I have a little bit more now is that because I've continued to develop my own artistic interests, and I have persisted, I don't have that naivety any longer. So I just need to be mindful of that and try not to kind of insert my work into the conversation. So the role of artist as facilitator has become very, very important to me more recently.
So Doug, I'm quite intrigued. So you get, I assume you selected topics of something that's going on in an organisation if you're working with an organisation-wide group. So say, for example, it's a change programme that's coming up and people are feeling a bit nervous about it. So you get them to create a piece of art, and then you discuss that piece of art. I'm quite curious that what the next step is after that. So, is it a process where that uncertainty and the conversations coming out of that uncertainty are then formalised, and then people do action plans, or is it far more freeform than that, or is it a bit of a mixture between the two? Well,
thank you. It's a great question, and I'm grateful because there are many answers, or many potential answers. So I think it really depends on what the client's interest is when they're actually engaged in this process. And I think it's important for me to work with them to understand that, so that we have a clear understanding of what a good outcome might look like, whilst being willing to accept that that may not be where we end up. So if we're exploring the notion of trying to get to know one another better, then that's something that can be explored through various art forms. It doesn't have to be visual art. It could be, it could be art that we make. It could be art that we photograph. It could be words and stories or verse. I'm open to participating in a broad variety of art forms, albeit visual art is something I find very interesting and useful for myself. But I prefer to create the environment where people are free to choose a method that might appeal to them, and then they can explore whatever the question is. So it might be, how do we get to know each other better? And that's quite an interesting one, because you can show some of your interests and other things in various ways. You can choose to describe them. In fact, I have a small project that I just concluded a couple of weeks ago, and one of the things that the group of people that I worked with chose to respond to was an opportunity to kind of do a mark making exercise. So as a way of breaking visual art down into its component parts, it's just a series of marks on a surface. So this group were playing with chalks and charcoals and pencils, monochrome, black and white, and began to make their own work on a large piece of paper. And as their work expanded, it came into contact with other people's work. And so they began to literally sort of bump into one another on this sheet. And they began to talk about what they were experiencing and how that was making them feel. And then we ended up with this great big piece of work, which as a thing to look at on the night was quite interesting. We had a good conversation about it. It's actually quite an impractical thing to do anything with because it's kind of 3 or 4 meters long. But what we subsequently did was we adopted the sort of destroy to create principle, if you like, and we sliced this large piece of work up into random chunks, which have now been mounted. And so the client now has 15 artworks in their reception that they made themselves that were part of a beginning of a journey, if you like, or an adventure to explore what does it mean to kind of get to know each other better. So they've created some artifacts. They've had some really good conversations about how this stuff makes them think and feel. And they're pondering what they'd like to do about it next. I mean, they found the process very enjoyable and interesting. And I've left it open with them that we could do more and that we could begin to apply the thinking to other methods. So that's a very basic start. I have done things that are much more about culture, connecting to things like culture and values. And a great question to ask people there is, what does it feel like to work here? It's all about giving people the time and space to think and do differently. And I've found some really fascinating responses emerge from that kind of question.
So how does that work then in terms of, so people create these pieces of art, whether it's visual or it's a piece of prose or what have you. Is your process that once they present this piece of art that you let the other people in the room kind of interpret that for themselves and then that's what the discussion is? Or is it more the sense the artist they present it and they talk about why they've created this piece of art? I mean, I'm just quite curious as to, do you let it speak for itself in the first instance, or do you have the artist actually explain the work right from the start? Good
question. I think I always prefer to let these things speak for themselves, but that is my preference. So typically when I work through a series of invitations. So people would be invited to opt into further dialogue. So if somebody felt that their work stood on its own and for itself and were happy for it to do so, then that's fine. If they felt they needed or wanted to go into more detail about it, again, that's fine. But for me, what's really important is that any process like this that's about kind of discovery and about learning, I feel it needs to be invitational. So you need to come along because you're curious and you want to be there, and you need to feel welcomed, and you need to feel that it's okay to take part, and actually it's okay not to take part too. So what I've noticed by using that kind of process as artist, as facilitator, and making that sort of thing very clear to people, it can produce quite an interesting effect. So I've worked with folks before who've kind of turned up, arms folded, and saying, I don't want to do this. I don't want to be here.
Yeah.
To which my response,
I was going to ask you about that actually.
Well, my response to that would always be, well, if you've been told to be here, then you weren't told by me. And I would hate for you to think you have to stay. You're very welcome to stay. You're very welcome to go. And you can participate as much or as little as you see fit. I find it interesting. If I go further back, I've been in situations where some of the work I've done has been quite, for want of a better word, coercive. Where people have been told, right, you've got to go and see this guy and you've got to do this, and that's not a good way to work. Particularly not when we're trying to explore possibilities and do things differently. So I'm very insistent that my process is invitational. I'm very open to the fact that means it could unfold and unfurl in lots of different directions, and I'm okay with that. But the idea that somebody feels they've got to turn up and do what they're told, I find is deeply unsettling to me. And actually, it's often a sign that needs to be flagged back to the organisation that, that's maybe not the best way to encourage a more creative approach to your work.
Yeah, because it's obviously it's a very progressive thing that you're doing, certainly in comparison to other pieces of learning and discussion groups and facilitated conversations. I mean, it is a new way of approaching this, and I think it's fascinating. I just wonder if in those circumstances where you'd probably have to allow yourself to be quite vulnerable, because I imagine there's probably quite a few things going on there. It's not only the things you're trying to say with your piece of art, but I would be particularly feeling anxious about my complete lack of artistic talent, and that's certainly something I would bring into a room with me. Now, I have no doubt whatsoever I would get over that, but that would definitely be a hump that would be there, that I would, would definitely feel like, right, I need to just park this and submit to this process. I guess it does have to be quite forward-thinking people that are certainly open-minded people that pick this up quite quickly.
Yes, and I think I can't stress enough that the importance of the environment. So you can imagine that I meet people with limiting beliefs about their artistic skills and prowess all the time. I am one, and so I can relate to it. So I'm comfortable that that's something to which I can honestly relate to. And I'm very comfortable to show people some of my earliest, naivest work. It's on display online, so it's not hard to find. But I'm able to show people, because I think it's really interesting. When we take a current object that we're working on, or a finished product, if you like, you look at it and you think, wow, I could never do that. But what we never see is all of the failures that went before it and all of the misadventure and all that kind of thing. So I'm happy to talk about all that kind of thing because I live it and breathe it. And I have plenty of examples to show people. And I find that as flippant as it sounds, that idea of drawing for the bin is very liberating, and I often find that actually if I literally hold the bin and invite people to destroy the thing and then throw it either at me or the bin, then that's also quite a useful release, and it helps us kind of park something. So I think these situations work. If people turn up and they're really keen, that's great. But if they turn up and they're nervous and they're worried, I'm not worried because I know the process and I know it's worth trusting. But I also know that I can relate to that uncertainty and fear, and I can talk to them about it from an experiential perspective. And I think that is often a useful way of helping us move on and actually getting into the work. So it's important to respect it. That's for sure. We
recently at GoodPractice engaged in a sort of company-wide branding workshop where we worked with a branding agency, and it was a sort of away day, and one of the exercises we were given to do is we were put into groups and we were given large pieces of card and sort of foam blocks. Basically, the idea was we were taking part in an imaginary protest march, and we had to come up with something that we were for and something that we were against, and we had to create sort of placard basically that we would take with us to our march. And it sort of involved quite a lot of artistic input. People, it's sort of all the things you're describing. People were initially kind of reluctant. There was some sort of arms crossed, people sort of rolling their eyes thinking, what's this?
Were you one of those, Ross?
Then there's also I mean, to be honest, initially I was. I thought, all right, okay, this is what we're going to do today. But I think actually, and then there is that concern of, can I actually draw what I want to be able to draw? And what's this going to look like if I have to show it to the whole room? But I think actually our limited artistic ability was actually quite good in that we thought, well, we can't draw this, so we had to sort of simplify or refine our ideas into something that we thought this is actually something that could be achievable. And it was sort of talking with your colleagues about what we stand for or who we are as a business, which is not something that you really do on a very regular basis, if ever. And so I think it was actually quite a good way of wrestling with that, what can be quite an abstract idea, and turning it into something tangible.
Well, it's cool, and I quite like. I mean, that's interesting. That's an interesting way of approaching it as well. Thinking about it in a. I suppose you're not just looking at it through an artistic lens there, but you're applying a cultural lens, both in terms of how you're thinking about the business, but also that nature of this, albeit an imaginary one, but the protest that you might be thinking about going along to either bat for or against or whatever. So actually, that's an interesting way of doing it. And just listening to how you were talking about it there, I think one of the things that you stumbled upon that I find very interesting is that you had that conversation. And you realise that actually, whatever it is, whatever the point, how can we best get our point across? And I think that's a really interesting, when people start to talk about that in the context of art and realise that actually I'm not here to try to Van Gogh-esque something, but I could be here to stickman-esque something, or other art forms are available. But having that dialogue, even just about the fact that, well, we need to get this message across. How are we going to do it? You're exploring. You're in an uncertain environment, and you're doing what smart folk do. They just start to talk about it and think about other ways of trying to kind of meet that challenge, if you like.
Yeah.
So
I think the value of it is almost in the process itself rather than the end product. Sort of not so much the piece of work that you create, but actually like drawing for the bin, like you were saying, and going through and having that discussion, if it's in a group or even if it's yourself. When you were talking previously, you reminded me, Cartier-Bresson, the photographer, has a quote that's attributed to him, which is, your first 10,000 photographs will be your worst. And which is, it's got that sort of whole parallel with the $10,000
motivating. Yes.
I think I'm on about 5,000 or something. But no, anyway, I thought that sort of like process of going through things and sort of refining down what it is you want to say, I think is actually the kind of valuable part of it.
Can I come back to you on that? Because I think you've hit on something really important there, and I think that it was when I began to appreciate that the process was what really mattered. I think that began to have all kinds of different effects, both on my own work as an artist, but also on my own work as a consultant, because actually, I think this is another thing that's really interesting, is that we get hung up on what the output or the outcome should be. And I don't know if we abdicate responsibility for the process or what, but I think it's a fundamental part of it. Doing the work to get to wherever you want to go is everything, really, because you won't get, you won't come to that end product. But also, I think that and this is much easier for me to appreciate in an explicitly artistic context, because I make art in the way I make it. I'm not a fine artist. I painted a picture of a cat once, which was a commissioned thing, which actually worked really well. But that's another story. But I'm not. You wouldn't hire me for a kind of realistic representation of your house or your family or whatever. You'd be deeply disappointed. But you would. But you would hire or commission me based on the process, because you can see the end results of the process, and you can see through talking to me how important that is. And actually, if I go back to that mark making exercise that I did in a company the other week, that's a really good way of focusing on process, because you're giving people kind of free rein, and once they get started, it's about just coming up with and co-creating something with no regard to what it's going to look like at the end. But actually, what's really interesting from my point of view is that something interesting visually emerges, as well as the conversation about it. So yeah, the process is vital.
Can I ask, have you ever used your techniques to explore certainty rather than uncertainty? Because sometimes actually, when it comes to uncertain things, that ignorance of the unknown is actually sometimes I feel I don't take things as seriously as they should do, because it's an unknown situation, so I'm not that nervous about it, because I perhaps naively think everything's going to be okay, and it's only when you're actually in it you think, oh Christ, I could have done with some of that exploratory workshop work. But things that I'm certain about, that I know are coming towards me, and a very basic example is public speaking, is, I've never really got over my nervousness of that. And when I know it's upcoming, I feel incredibly anxious about it. And it just strikes me some of the things you're talking about there would be quite helpful in terms of exploring, if you're certain you're going to be nervous about something or anxious about something, let's use your techniques to pick that apart. And I just wondered if you've had any experience of actually doing it from that perspective.
Thank you. I am quite a nervous performer, so I can understand and relate to that. And I'll be honest, I haven't flipped the project or the session or whatever around in a way in which you've just described. But what I have done, so I when was it now? 18 months or so ago, I began what turned into a 30-odd week sort of residency at an local open mic night, And I did it because I was feeling quite stuck, and because I wanted to try to combat stage fright, nerves and other things. And I thought, actually, well, I'll go and put myself in that environment and I'll just deal with it and I'll just kind of keep going back. And it was quite a brutal approach, particularly early on. I found it hurt a lot. But it reminded me that actually, if I can do this, then I can do something else. And it allowed me to talk to people. So when I work with people who are uncertain about the process, I have a number of different experiences that I can offer, which I can talk to them about and say, it'll be okay. I managed to do this and nobody died. I mean, a few people's ears might have hurt as a result of it, but we got through it all. But I think what you've hit upon there is a really interesting notion. And I confess I haven't thought about it and framed it that way. So I'm grateful to you for thinking of it. And I think I'm going to have to steal that and have a play around with it. Thank you. It sounds like it's got lots of possibilities.
My gift to you.
Thank you.
Happy Christmas.
I guess one way to round off the conversation would be, that I think like what we've been talking about, or to bring it back to uncertainty, like a lot of it is to do with what you were saying at the beginning, Doug, about just sort of, there needing to be some sort of measurable outcome at the end of this sort of type of exercise. And when we talk about uncertainty, so much of it is geared towards mitigating uncertainty, or managing ambiguity and lowering risk. But your perspective seems to be that there is actually something quite valuable in uncertainty, and there's something we can learn from it.
I believe so, yeah. And again, I think it's contextual. And for some people, that will not be appropriate, if you like. But if you think about the notion of, I suppose it depends if you view uncertainty as a challenge or a risk, or as an opportunity. And I think it could be either. It again depends on what the context is. But I mean, one of the things I find interesting is that typically, when faced with an uncertain environment, what a traditional kind of organisational response will be to seek to try to control it. And again, there's context where that's quite reasonable. But if we are interested in learning and development, then very often, if we start to begin to exercise too much control over a situation, then we demonstrate through our behaviour that actually we're not willing to see uncertainty, and therefore by association perhaps creativity and or innovation as an important thing, because when we see something that we don't recognise and we're not familiar with it, what we'll do is we'll seek to control it and clamp it down and restrict it. So I think it is it's a tricky one, but in terms of trying to define what the outcome is, if you like, because to some extent we might be undertaking a piece of work where we're not really sure. At the vaguest level, but actually, if it's an organisation who, let's say, for example, are curious about how we might do things differently around here in pursuit of, I'm going to choke on the term I'm about to use, but in the pursuit of something like a better employee experience or a customer experience or something like that, then I think there's a very powerful place for, uncertainty has a very powerful role in that kind of environment, because by very nature, we've got to be willing to do things differently. And by doing things differently, we've got to accept the fact that we don't necessarily know how that's going to pan out and play out. So before we try it on other people, maybe we should try it on ourselves. And that's where playing with some of these more artistic methods can be quite an interesting way of just actually getting us comfortable and ready to go and try it out with other people.
So we'll move on now to our regular feature, What I Learned This Week, where we each share something we learned in the past 7 days. James, would you like to get us started? I know you love this segment.
Oh, it would be my absolute pleasure to be the first one to do it. So obviously this has been the Easter weekend we've just come off of, and for once even Scotland had glorious weather we were able to indulge in. So myself and my partner, we deliberately didn't plan anything for the weekend so we could do things around the house, and in the garden and stuff. So, I did the house things and my other half did the garden stuff. And, I finished all my house chores in a day, whereas he had endless stuff still to do in the garden. So by the Sunday, I was starting to feel a bit guilty, like sitting there sipping gin and tonics and reading the papers while he was kind of merrily digging away. So despite my inner demon saying, just let him, he made his garden bed, he can lie in it. I did help him. And, so I kind of learned a new skill. I've never been green-fingered at all, apart from like kind of pulling out weeds and what have you. I've never really helped out in the garden. But actually I did learn a new skill, at the weekend there. We dug up, parts of the garden. We planted some lovely plants, put membrane down, then planted the plants in there, put the barking on it, so the weeds didn't come back through. And I had actually no idea that, I literally just thought you just dug up a hole and stuck a plant in there and put the soil back over. I didn't realize it was so involved in all things like the lining part, where you kind of have to kind of dig up all the stones and kind of thump that in. It was all far more involved than I expected. So I came away with a new sympathy for the likes of the Charlie Dimmicks of this world. That actually there is it's not just graft. There is actually skill involved in setting up and then maintaining a garden. So I have a newfound respect for the gardeners of this world, and I have a new skill as well, which was very nice.
Lovely. It was a nice weekend for it.
It was beautiful, yeah. It was very nice. I was soon back to my, enjoyable. Kind of picking up all the weeds and stuff after that, because even though I say I've learned the skill, I wasn't very good at it. But at least I had a go at it.
Yeah. Enough knowledge to be dangerous.
Exactly. Enough knowledge to say at least I tried, and should probably never try again. So,
Doug, what did you learn this week?
Well, I embarked on a new project recently, or an adaptation of a project recently, in order to take part in a forthcoming art show, which is called Cut, Spray and Pray, which is all about cutting stencils, and single layer stencils. So I've been playing with stencils and spray paint for a while, but I joined this group. I was invited to take part in this opportunity, and what I noticed by being a member of this group, I've only ever met two of the artists in real life, but we have a Facebook group and we're sharing ideas and thoughts as our work develops. And what I've noticed is that I've produced 3 pieces of work for this show, and even though I say it myself, I think they're probably the 3 best cuts that I've made to date. And I've been cutting stencils for about a year, and the primary reason why they're as good as they are is because I've been working in a group of very good people. So I've been seeing some amazing work appear in front of me. I've been working in an environment which is not competitive. So nobody has come in there and go, look how fantastic my work is. But what people have done is they've shared what they've been producing so that other people can see it and acknowledge it if they want to. And people have also been very generous with their advice. So how do you get this to work like that, and how do you get that to work like this? And what I've learned from being a part of this group, and like I say, I finished the 3 sprays this week, is that when you're in an environment with very good people, but not and it doesn't have to be a competitive one, and I think in this case it's really important that it wasn't, then you can take your own skills to another level just by surrounding yourself with very good people and making sure the environment's encouraging and not competitive. Certainly worked for me anyway.
What I learned this week is actually revisiting a theme from our Room 101 episode. So one of the items I cast into Room 101 was the use of bad stock photography in e-learning. And towards the end of last week, I was working on a project that involved using a lot of stock photography, and I was just banging my head off of the wall by the end of it. I think, I said in the Room 101 episode that there's a sort of general sense that stock photography has improved a lot, and there's lots of other good sources out there, websites like Unsplash, where there's images that are freely available. But if you're looking for images for a very specific scenario,
it's a nightmare.
It is an absolute nightmare. And just, trying to find, if you look at stock photography, and if you're an alien and you look to stock photography as a representation of this is what working life is like, everybody is constantly you know, smiling these like cheesy grins all the time and looking directly at the camera. Tipex teeth, yeah. And it amazes me that it has not improved since then. I mean, I don't know if you guys have seen it, but Emilia Clarke of Game of Thrones fame has a very funny stock photography sort of spoof video where she's been hired to act out these classic stock photography scenes, and it is absolutely hilarious. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. Yeah,
please do.
I think the only thing worse than picking stock photography is listening to stock music.
Yes.
And realising your idea of upbeat or jazz or rumba or whatever is very different from what another person's idea of it is. And yeah, if your eyes are bleeding at the stock photography, trust me, your ears will be bleeding at the stock music.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And that's all for this week. If you'd like to share your thoughts on the show, you can find us all on Twitter. James is...
at James McLuckie.
Doug is...
I'm at Doug Shaw 1, the number 1.
And you've also got a website, don't you, Doug?
Yeah, so the best place to find all the other connections is consultingartist.com.
Great, we'll put a link to that in the show notes. You can also reach me on Twitter at Ross_Dickie. You can also tweet at GoodPractice or at GoodPracticeAUS. To find out more about Good Practice, our performance support toolkit, bespoke e-learning and LMS, visit goodpractice.com. Next week, Ross, G and Owen are back along with Peter and guest John Helmer to talk about emerging tech and L&D. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.